The night before the battle did not end in sleep. It ended in waiting. A cold wind slipped through the cedar trees, surrounding Azu, carrying with it the distant thud of artillery. Each explosion rolled across the land like a warning, low and relentless. Somewhere beyond the hills, the Imperial Army was advancing. Modern rifles, foreign cannons, banners of New Japan. Inside a dimly lit hall near the castle grounds, a group of women knelt in silence, their shadows flickering against wooden walls as oil lamps trembled. Armor lay open beside them, not ceremonial, not decorative, real lamellar plates, scuffed and repaired, laced together by hands that had learned patience long before they learned violence. Fingers moved carefully, tying cords, tightening straps. No one spoke at first. Words felt fragile here. A young woman finally broke the silence with a whisper. "They say the rifles can kill from farther than we can see." No one corrected her. No one needed to. Everyone already knew. Outside, boots marched. Horses snorted. Orders were shouted, then swallowed by the wind. The men of Azu had already gone to the front lines days earlier. Fathers, brothers, husbands. Those who remained were too young, too old, or too wounded to fight. The women understood what that meant. At the front of the room stood Nakano Takiko. She was only 21, but her presence carried the weight of command. Her naginata rested against the wall, its blade freshly sharpened, its shaft worn smooth by years of training. She had studied poetry and philosophy, memorized classical texts, and practiced martial forms before dawn while others slept. This moment, this terrible final moment, felt unreal, like stepping into a story written by someone else. She listened to the sounds of war creeping closer and spoke quietly. "They will reach the river by morning." A woman beside her swallowed hard. "Then the castle gates will not hold," Nakano said. Her voice did not tremble. Not without time. A gust of wind blew out one of the lamps. Darkness pressed in for a heartbeat before another flame caught. Faces appeared again, pale, determined, afraid. They all felt it now. Fear didn't scream. It settled into the chest like ice. Nakano continued, slower this time. "We are not going to win. That is not our task." Several women lowered their eyes. One clenched her fist so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Our task," Nakano said, "is to make them stop, even if only for hours." Outside, a rifle cracked. Then another. The sound was sharp, unfamiliar. Nothing like the clash of blades they had trained for. The future had arrived, and it did not care about tradition. One woman began to cry quietly, pressing her sleeve to her mouth to silence the sound. Another reached out and held her hand. No one judged her. Courage did not mean the absence of fear. It meant standing up anyway. When the armor was secured, they rose together. The weight settled onto their shoulders. Physical, yes, but also symbolic. Once worn, it meant there was no turning back. The march to the river was slow and silent. Mist hugged the ground, curling around their ankles as if trying to pull them back. Birds scattered from the trees as the women moved through the brush, their breath visible in the cold air. Somewhere ahead, Imperial soldiers laughed, unaware. Nakano raised her hand, and the group halted. Through the fog, silhouettes appeared, men with rifles slung casually, confident, careless. The women crouched low. The smell of damp earth filled their lungs. For a moment, time stretched thin. Nakano thought of her mother's voice, of ink on paper, of mornings that would never come. Then she dropped her hand. They surged forward from the mist, screaming, not words, pure sound, a release of everything they had held inside. The first Imperial soldier turned just in time to see a blade arc toward him. His rifle fell uselessly as the naginata cut through cloth and flesh. Another tried to raise his weapon. Too slow. Steel met bone. Blood splashed onto the grass. Shouts erupted. Confusion spread. "Women!" someone yelled, disbelief cracking his voice. Rifles fired wildly. Smoke filled the air. A woman spun and fell, her armor useless against lead. Another pressed forward, teeth bared, striking again and again until a bullet tore through her shoulder and dropped her to her knees. The clash was brutal, intimate, chaotic. The women closed distance fast, where rifles became awkward and fear took over. For precious moments, the Imperial line broke. Nakano fought at the front. Her movements were precise, drilled into muscle memory. She struck, stepped, turned. Another soldier fell. Then another. Pain exploded in her side, hot and blinding. She staggered, gasping, the world tilting. She knew instantly. A bullet. Her legs buckled. Her sister reached her just in time, catching her before she hit the ground. Around them, the battle raged on, screams, gunfire, steel, but already felt distant. Nakano looked up at the gray sky. Snowflakes had begun to fall, melting as they touched her face. "Do not let them take me," she whispered. Her sister shook her head, tears streaming. "Please." Nakano smiled faintly. "Be strong." The rifle fire continued. Time was being bought. Lives were being spent. And the river, for a little while longer, did not fall. The battle did not end with a trumpet or a command. It dissolved into fragments, smoke thinning, gunfire spacing out, screams fading into groans. Snow continued to fall, quiet and indifferent, settling on bodies that no longer moved. The Imperial soldiers advanced again, cautiously now, stepping over the fallen with weapons raised, eyes sharp with a new kind of fear. They had expected peasants. They had expected scattered resistance. They had not expected this. An officer barked orders, his voice tight. The laughter from earlier was gone. Rifles were reloaded with shaking hands. No one rushed forward anymore. Each step felt like it might be punished. Along the riverbank, the women who still lived regrouped in small clusters. Their numbers were thin now. Faces were smeared with blood, some their own, some not. Armor was dented, cords torn, blades chipped. Breathing came in short, painful bursts. One woman dropped to her knees beside a fallen companion and closed her eyes with trembling fingers. She whispered a prayer she barely remembered from childhood. Another stared blankly at her hands, as if surprised to find them still attached. The delay had worked. From the direction of the castle, the sound of movement rose. Wagons rolling, people shouting, children crying. Civilians were escaping while they still could. Every heartbeat here meant another life somewhere else. A crack of rifle fire tore through the air. A woman standing near the river stiffened, then fell forward without a sound. The bullet had found her spine. The rest flinched, instinctively ducking, but no one ran. There was nowhere left to run to. They charged again, not as a unit now, but as individuals driven by instinct and rage. Steel flashed. A soldier went down screaming, as a blade hooked behind his knee and dragged him to the ground. Another fired point blank, the recoil knocking him backward as the woman he shot collapsed into the snow. The Imperial line finally stabilized. Orders came quickly now, practiced, efficient. A volley fired together, disciplined. Several women fell at once, their bodies jerking as bullets struck home. The rest stopped advancing. The distance between sword and rifle became impossible to cross. Smoke hung low over the field. The wind carried the smell of blood and burned powder. When it was over, silence returned in pieces. The Imperial soldiers stood among the dead, breathing hard, staring at what lay before them. Some turned away, unable to look. Others stared too long, as if trying to understand what they had just faced. An officer finally spoke, quieter than before. "Gather the wounded. Move forward slowly." No trophies were taken. No victory cries rose. The battle had been won, but it did not feel like triumph. By the time the troops reached the next ridge, the sun was already low. The delay had cost them most of the day. At Aizu Castle, the gates were closing behind the last of the evacuees. Women clutched children. Old men leaned on staffs. The wounded were carried inside on doors torn from their hinges. When the gate slammed shut, a heavy silence followed. They had been given time. Inside the castle, word spread quickly, passed in whispers and broken sentences. They were women. They fought at the river. They didn't retreat. Some refused to believe it. Others nodded, as if it made terrible sense. Days later, the war ended. Aizu fell. The Tokugawa loyalists were defeated. Imperial banners flew where old ones had once stood. Japan stepped fully into a new age. Rifles, factories, foreign advisors. Swords were ordered turned in. Armor was packed away or destroyed. Official records were written carefully. Battles were listed. Casualties counted. Commanders named. The women at the river were barely mentioned. In some reports, they did not exist at all. But stories survived where ink failed. Imperial soldiers carried them home, speaking in low voices about the fog and the screams, about blades appearing out of nowhere, about fear they had never felt before. In Aizu, families spoke the names of the fallen quietly, as if saying them too loudly might make the loss real again. Years passed. The castle ruins were cleared. Children grew up in a Japan that no longer needed samurai. The idea of women warriors became something strange, almost embarrassing, better left unspoken. Yet the ground remembered. Where the river bends, grass still grew thick and dark. Farmers said the soil there was rich. They avoided plowing too deep. Courage does not always change the outcome of war. Sometimes it only changes the cost. Those women did not stop the future. They did not save their clan. They did not appear in most history books. What they did was stand when standing meant everything. They faced fear without illusions of glory. They fought not for empire or recognition, but for time, for the chance that someone else might live. War rewards victory. History rewards power. But the measure of sacrifice is not written by the winners. It is written in the silence that follows, in the lives that continue, and in the names spoken softly by those who remember. Long before the river ran red, before rifles replaced bows and banners gave way to smoke, there were other women who learned the way to steel in their hands. Their stories did not begin in desperation, but in duty. In an age when war was expected, not sudden, some families prepared their daughters the same way they prepared their sons. Quietly, seriously, without apology. In the Kamakura period, when rival clans tested their strength against one another, the absence of men was common. Campaigns lasted months, sometimes years. Castles were left in the care of those who remained behind. Women learned quickly that walls alone did not defend a home. Someone had to stand on them. Tomo Guzan was one such woman. The chronicles describe her with careful admiration, as if the writers themselves were uncertain how to explain her existence. She was said to be beautiful, yes, but stronger than most men, skilled with bow and blade, fearless on horseback. These details were recorded not to praise her femininity, but to justify why she appeared on a battlefield at all. During the Genpei War, when the Taira and Minamoto clans tore the country apart, Tomo rode into combat beside Minamoto no Yashinaka. She did not guard supply lines or tend the wounded. She fought in the vanguard. At the Battle of Owazu, the Minamoto forces were collapsing. Yashinaka's army was surrounded. Men fled. Lines broke. Tomo did not retreat. She rode forward, her horse splashing through mud and blood, searching for an enemy worthy of her blade. The story says she found him, a warrior renowned for his strength. They clashed amid the chaos. Tomo struck him from his saddle, took his head, and rode on. Then she vanished from the record. Some accounts say Yashinaka ordered her to flee, unwilling to die beside a woman. Others claim she fought to the end and fell with the rest. No one knows which is true. The uncertainty itself became part of her legend. What mattered was that she had existed at all. Centuries later, women still trained with Naginata in quiet courtyards. Not for glory, not for campaigns, for defense. The long blade was ideal against cavalry, capable of keeping armored men at a distance. It was taught not as rebellion, but as responsibility. When enemies breached castle walls, women were expected to fight. If defeat was certain, they were expected to die with dignity. This was not romantic. It was grim, methodical, and taught from mother to daughter, without ceremony. During the Sengoku period, Japan lived in constant war. Daimyo rose and fell like seasons. Alliances shattered overnight. Castles changed hands through siege and betrayal. In these times, women defended gates, commanded units, and sometimes led troops when no one else remained. Hojo Masako did not wield a sword on the battlefield, but she commanded power just as dangerous. After the death of her husband, Minamoto no Yoritomo, She became a political force feared by warriors and nobles alike. Known as the nun shogun, she controlled armies through authority rather than steel. Her warfare was quieter, but no less ruthless. History had room for her because her power fit into systems men already understood. Women like Tomo did not. As peace slowly settled during the Edo period, the image of the samurai hardened into something ceremonial, masculine, controlled. The warrior woman became an inconvenience, a reminder that survival had once required flexibility, not ideals. Training continued, but mostly in theory. The Naginata became a symbol of refinement rather than necessity. Manuals were written. Forms were practiced. The idea of real combat drifted further away, until it returned. When foreign ships appeared on the horizon in the 19th century, black smoke rising from their funnels, Japan's long peace shattered. Old certainties collapsed. The samurai class was forced to confront a world that did not care about tradition. And once again, war did not ask who was supposed to fight. In Aizu, women drilled with renewed urgency. The old teachings suddenly mattered again. The way of the blade, the angle of the strike, the discipline of standing firm. These were not lessons from the past. They were preparations for something approaching fast. Elders spoke of Tomo Guzan as if invoking a spirit. Mothers corrected their daughters' grips with sharper eyes. No one said aloud, but everyone understood. If the men fell, the responsibility would pass, as it always had. When the imperial army arrived with rifles and cannon, the gap between old and new warfare became brutally clear. Tradition could not stop bullets. Skill could not outrun artillery. But courage remained unchanged. The women who fought at the river did not see themselves as legends. They did not imagine their actions echoing through centuries. They were the continuation of something older than the state itself, a line of quiet readiness, broken only when history chose to forget it. The past was not dead. It was standing beside them, blade in hand, asking only one question. Would you stand too? They answered without words. After the fall of Aizu, the land did not immediately feel defeated. It felt hollow. Smoke drifted from burned storehouses. Broken banners lay half-buried in mud. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the sound of battle as the imperial army dismantled what remained of the old order piece by piece. The women who survived the fighting did not return home as warriors. They returned as widows, daughters, caretakers. Armor was hidden or quietly destroyed. Blades were wrapped in cloth and buried beneath floorboards. To be seen as a fighter now was dangerous. The new Japan had little patience for reminders of resistance. Yet memories do not obey decrees. In the evenings, when children asked why certain fields were never plowed, or why their mothers fell silent at the sound of thunder, the answers came slowly. Stories were not told as stories. They were told as warnings, as lessons, as things not to be repeated. Some imperial officers privately acknowledged what had happened at the river. They did not speak of it in reports, but the experience followed them. Facing an enemy who fought without expectation of survival unsettled even seasoned soldiers. It disrupted the clean logic of modern warfare. War, they learned, was not only about technology. It was about resolve. As the Meiji government tightened its control, reforms came swiftly. Domains were abolished. The samurai class was stripped of privileges. Swords were banned from public wear. Schools taught a new history, one that emphasized unity, progress, and loyalty to the emperor. There was no place in that story for women who defied order by taking up arms. And so they faded, but not entirely. In rural areas, Naginata training did not disappear. It changed its language. What had once been taught as battlefield readiness became discipline and character building. The movements remained the same. The intent did not. Young girls practiced under the watchful eyes of mothers and grandmothers who corrected them with an authority born of experience. They spoke of posture, of balance, of breathing. They did not speak of blood. Some of those women had stood at the river. They never said so. Decades later, as Japan entered new wars, echoes of the past surfaced again. During the early 20th century, nationalist narratives reshaped history once more. Samurai ideals were revived, polished, and used to inspire loyalty and sacrifice. Men were glorified as warriors of the nation. Women were praised too, but as supporters, mothers, symbols of purity. The warrior woman remained inconvenient. In textbooks, Tomoe appeared briefly, framed as an exception so rare it did not challenge the rule. The women of Azu were omitted entirely. The idea that women had once fought and died in organized combat conflicted with the image of order the state wished to project. Yet outside official history, fragments survived. A family shrine with no name on the plaque. A Naginata blade kept oiled though no one claimed it. A lullaby whose lyrics mentioned snow, steel, and waiting. After the Second World War, Japan rebuilt again, this time from near total destruction. Cities rose where ashes had been. The country turned away from militarism, and with it, from many martial traditions. The past became something to manage carefully. Still, questions emerged. Historians began to re-examine old records, marginal notes, half-erased entries. Archaeologists uncovered mass graves near battle sites, some containing women's remains alongside weapons. These discoveries did not rewrite history overnight, but they cracked it. Who were these women? Why were they there? The answers pointed backward, toward a truth long ignored. The Onna-Bugeisha were not anomalies. They were part of a system designed for survival in an unstable world. When war was constant, ability mattered more than gender. When peace returned, those same women became uncomfortable, reminders of chaos. Remembering them meant admitting that history was more flexible and more brutal than official narratives allowed. In Azu, a small memorial eventually appeared. It did not name every woman. Many names were lost. It spoke instead of sacrifice, of defense, of lives given so others could flee. Visitors often passed it without noticing. Those who stopped felt something heavier than pride. War does not honor all who fight. It selects, it edits, and what remains is shaped by whoever holds a pen. The women at the river did not hold the pen. They held the line. Their legacy was not victory. It was proof that courage is not assigned. It emerges when circumstances demand it. Proof that history, when stripped of myth, is far more complex and far more human than we are taught. The snow melted, the river flowed on, and beneath its surface, the memory of steel endured. Memory is a fragile thing. It does not survive by strength alone. It survives because someone chooses to carry it forward, quietly, often at personal cost. In the years after the major reforms, many women who had once trained for war lived long enough to see their skills dismissed as relics. Some married and raised families. Others entered temples. A few remained unmarried, their past folded neatly into silence. They learned when to speak and when not to. Japan was changing fast, and survival now meant adaptation rather than resistance. But adaptation did not mean forgetting. In isolated villages, old women still corrected stance with a tap of the staff. They still insisted on discipline, on awareness of space, on the calm that came before movement. To outsiders, it looked like tradition. To those who knew, it was continuity. A young girl once asked her grandmother why the Naginata blade had to be kept sharp if it would never be used. The old woman paused before answering. Her hands lingered on the whetstone. "Because dullness," she said finally, "is how you invite danger." She did not explain further. As Japan entered the 20th century, the country found itself pulled once again toward war. Industrialization brought power, and power brought ambition. When conflict erupted abroad, the state mobilized its population with efficiency learned from earlier upheavals. This time, women were not asked to fight with weapons. They were asked to endure. Factories replaced battlefields. Long hours replaced marches. Loss returned, steady and relentless. Sons went to war. Many did not return. Mothers learned about deeply when officials arrived at their doors. The idea of women as warriors was inconvenient in this new context. It clashed with the narrative of sacrifice being made primarily by men at the front. And yet, the emotional labor of war, the waiting, the uncertainty, the rebuilding, fell heavily on women once again. Strength took different forms. After 1945, Japan stood amid ruins more complete than anything seen before. The defeat was absolute. The cost was visible everywhere. In this shattered landscape, The country redefined itself, rejecting militarism and reshaping its identity around peace and economic recovery. Martial traditions survived mostly as sport, ritual, or cultural performance. The Naginata became part of physical education, framed as a way to build character rather than prepare for combat. The language softened. The history did not. Some practitioners, especially women, felt an unspoken connection to something deeper. Movements practiced in gyms echoed techniques once used on walls and riverbanks. Breathing patterns matched those taught centuries earlier for battle. They trained without knowing all the names, without knowing all the stories. But the body remembered. Historians in the late 20th century began to ask different questions. Instead of focusing only on generals and outcomes, they looked at households, local records, letters. In doing so, they found gaps that could no longer be ignored. Why did certain castles have weapon stores sized for smaller frames? Why did burial records list women among combat dead without explanation? Why did regional songs reference blades and blood when sung by women? The answers were not clean. They contradicted simplified narratives. They forced a reconsideration of who had been allowed to act in moments of crisis. Slowly, the term Onna-Bugeisha re-entered discussion, not as legend, but as category. Academic papers followed. Museums adjusted exhibits. A few names were recovered. Many were not. Recognition came late, and unevenly. For some descendants, learning the truth was unsettling. It reframed family history. A grandmother remembered as strict and distant suddenly appeared in a different light. Her silences gained meaning. For others, it brought quiet pride, not because war was noble, but because survival had demanded courage without promise of reward. The women who fought had not asked to redefine gender roles. They had responded to necessity. When circumstances demanded action, they acted. When circumstances demanded silence, they endured that too. That duality, strength and action, strength and restraint, was perhaps their greatest legacy. War reduces people to functions: fighter, supporter, victim. But real lives are more complicated. The Onna-Bugeisha moved between roles as history pushed them, never fully fitting the categories imposed afterward. They were not symbols. They were individuals making choices under pressure. In remembering them, the point is not to romanticize their deaths or glorify violence. It is to acknowledge reality as it was, not as it was later edited to be more comfortable. They existed. They fought. They were forgotten. And now, piece by piece, they are being remembered not as exceptions, but as part of the human response to chaos. History does not move in straight lines. It circles back, asking the same questions in different forms. Who will stand when systems fail? Who will act when roles collapse? The women of Japan's past answered those questions once with steel in their hands and fear in their hearts. Their answer did not echo loudly, but it endured. Endurance does not announce itself. It works quietly, often unnoticed, shaping lives long after the moment of crisis has passed. For the women who had taken up arms, survival meant carrying memories that could not be shared openly. Their bodies bore the marks, old wounds that ached in winter, fingers that stiffened around cups of tea, but their voices remained careful. Some lived long enough to see Japan transform into a nation of trains, factories, and electric lights. The world they had fought to defend no longer existed, and the world that replaced it had no language for what they had been. There were no medals, no ceremonies, only the knowledge of what had been done when there was no alternative. In family records, gaps appeared. A death without explanation. A woman who never married, whose name was written once and never mentioned again. These silences were not accidental. They were chosen, shaped by a society eager to move forward without confronting every cost. Yet the landscape itself refused to forget. In regions that had seen heavy fighting, local customs persisted. Annual offerings left near rivers. Stones stacked carefully where no shrine stood. Elders insisted on certain rituals without fully explaining why. Children accepted them as part of life, unaware they were participating in remembrance. One such river ran through a quiet valley where the water slowed and widened. Villagers avoided fishing there. When asked why, They shrugged and said the current was unpredictable. The real reason was older. Stories said the river had once run red, and some memories were not meant to be disturbed. As scholarship expanded, historians began to notice patterns beyond individual figures like Tomo Guzin. They saw networks of training, inheritance of martial knowledge, and regional differences that suggested organization rather than anomaly. Women were not randomly appearing on battlefields. They were prepared, intentionally, for specific circumstances. This challenged long-held assumptions. It meant acknowledging that the division between combatant and non-combatant had never been as rigid as later narratives suggested. In times of stability, roles hardened. In times of collapse, they dissolved. The Onna-Bugeisha were products of collapse. Their existence forced an uncomfortable question. How many other groups had been erased because they did not fit the story someone wanted to tell? The answer was not small. In popular culture, reinterpretations began to appear. Novels, films, and television series featured warrior women inspired loosely by history. These portrayals were dramatic, often exaggerated, sometimes empowering, sometimes misleading. They brought attention, but also distortion. Real lives became symbols. The truth was quieter, less glamorous, more difficult to sell. Real women fought while knowing they would likely die. They fought without expectation of recognition. They fought because retreat meant annihilation for those behind them. There is no spectacle in that, only resolve. Modern practitioners of martial arts, particularly women, sometimes felt an unspoken connection to this past. In the controlled environment of a dojo, movements were practiced safely, respectfully, yet within the repetition. There was an awareness that these forms had once been executed under lethal pressure. That awareness changed posture, changed intent, not to glorify violence, but to understand its weight. Understanding is a form of respect. As discussions about gender and history evolved, the Onna-Bugeisha became part of broader conversations about agency, responsibility, and representation. They were no longer curiosities. They were evidence. Evidence that capability is situational. Evidence that necessity overrides ideology. Evidence that history simplifies because complexity is harder to carry. For descendants, reclaiming these stories was not about pride in combat. It was about completeness. About seeing ancestors not as passive figures swept along by events, but as actors who made choices under pressure. Those choices did not always lead to survival. Many ended in unmarked graves. But choice itself matters. War often strips people of choice. That is its cruelty. The fact that these women still chose to stand, to fight, to protect, does not make war noble. It makes their humanity visible. As memorials slowly expanded and academic work continued, a clearer picture emerged. Not a single heroic narrative, but a mosaic of responses to fear. Some women fought. Some supported. Some endured in silence. All were affected. The danger of rediscovery is romanticization, the temptation to turn suffering into inspiration without acknowledging cost. Remembering the Onna-Bugeisha requires restraint. It requires accepting that their courage came with terror, pain, and loss, that their actions did not fix the world. They simply held it together long enough for others to escape. In that sense, their story is not exceptional. It is deeply human. Every era produces moments when ordinary people are forced into extraordinary roles. Most are forgotten. A few are mythologized. Between myth and oblivion lies history. The women of Japan's past stand there still, waiting not for praise, but for honesty. The first light of dawn crept over the ridge, casting long, cold shadows across the battlefield. Mist clung stubbornly to the valleys, curling like ghostly fingers around the fallen banners of the last skirmish. The air smelled of wet earth, sweat, and the iron tang of blood, a scent that had become almost normal to the samurai women, yet never wholly accepted. Haruko wiped her blade clean, the fabric of her kimono damp against her skin. "They're regrouping," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the low rumble of distant war drums. Around her, the other women sharpened their weapons in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy forces were gathering like storm clouds. Each of them bore the weight of both duty and dread, a dual load that pressed on their hearts with every slow, deliberate breath. A sudden clatter drew Haruko's attention. From a tree line, a young scout returned, bow in hand, his face pale and drawn. "They've reinforced their flank," he reported, voice trembling. "More cavalry and archers. They'll try to cut us off before we reach the river crossing." Haruko's grip tightened on her sword. The river crossing was crucial. If they failed to secure it, their mission would crumble. "Then we fight differently," she said, voice low but firm. "We draw them into the valley, where their numbers won't matter as much. Keep your wits, sisters. Focus. We do not falter." The other women nodded, a chorus of silent promises. Behind them, the sounds of war began to swell. The thundering of hooves, the clash of metal on metal, the war cries of men who had been bred for battle, yet lacked the steel in their hearts that the women carried. Every sound was amplified by tension, every shadow a potential threat. Haruko recalled the first battle she had seen. The fear, the surge of adrenaline, the way the earth seemed to tremble beneath the charge of 1,000 soldiers. It had been overwhelming, but she had learned, as had the others, that fear could be harnessed. It could sharpen reflexes, heighten awareness, and ignite a courage that no sword alone could summon. "Haruko!" A voice rang out, sharp, insistent. It was Michiko, one of the older warriors, pointing toward the east ridge. A small group of enemy archers had crested the hill, their arrows poised. "They're aiming for the scouts." Haruko sprinted forward, signaling the others. "Form a line. Shields up." The air seemed to thicken with tension, each second stretching into eternity as the enemy released their volley. Arrows cut through the mist, whistling like angry spirits, embedding themselves in the ground and in trees around them. The women held their positions, letting the rain of death pass overhead. And when it ended, the silence that followed was deafening. A wounded soldier groaned from the ground, clutching his shoulder. Haruko moved to him, her heart hammering. "Stay with us," she urged, pressing a hand to his wound. Around them, the battlefield was alive with motion. Dust rising from the horses' hooves, banners snapping in the cold wind, the rhythmic pounding of distant drums echoing like a heartbeat. Then came the charge. From a valley, enemy cavalry surged forward, a living wall of polished armor and gleaming weapons. Haruko's squad braced. "Hold the line. Protect the river crossing," she shouted, voice slicing through the chaos. Steel clanged against steel as the first wave struck, and screams erupted in a dreadful chorus. The ground shook beneath the force of impact, and Haruko found herself grappling with an enemy soldier, each thrust and parry a desperate dance with death. Amid the fighting, a different kind of fear took root, one not born of immediate danger, but the realization that the battle could last until the sun dipped below the horizon, and not all would survive. Yet even in the midst of terror, Haruko felt something remarkable, a calm, resolute focus. Every motion had purpose, every glance measured, every strike precise. The women fought not just for victory, but for survival, for honor, for the memory of those who had fallen before them. "Haruko!" Left flank collapsing. Michiko yelled, voice sharp, carrying over the din of battle. Without hesitation, Haruko shifted, gathering a small contingent of warriors to reinforce the line. They moved like shadows among chaos, a fluid force that met the enemy with coordinated strikes. Each clash of swords was a story in itself, a brief moment where life and death balanced on the edge of the blade. Above, the sky began to darken with smoke and cloud, the wind carrying the acrid scent of fire. Somewhere downstream, a supply wagon had ignited, sending flames licking hungrily at the surrounding brush. The noise was overwhelming, yet the women persisted, their unity a stark contrast to the disorder around them. In a brief lull, Haruko paused, chest heaving, eyes scanning the battlefield. Bodies littered the earth, enemy and ally alike, and for a fleeting moment, the enormity of what they were doing pressed down like a physical weight. "We fight," she whispered, almost to herself, "because we must, because no one else can." Her voice carried across the valley, a fragile thread of resolve in a world consumed by violence. The river shimmered ahead, a narrow ribbon of hope in a landscape of despair. If they could reach it, if they could hold it even for a moment longer, they might turn the tide. But to get there, they would have to survive the next wave, and the one after that, until courage alone was their only armor. From the ridge, an enemy commander shouted orders, his voice sharp and commanding. Haruko met his gaze briefly, seeing not hatred but calculation, a mind trained in strategy, a heart hardened by war. The recognition was mutual. Each side knew that this fight was more than a skirmish. It was a test of endurance, skill, and willpower. As the next charge formed, Haruko tightened her grip on her sword, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hands. "For honor," she murmured to the others around her. "For our sisters, for those who cannot fight, stand firm." The valley erupted once more into chaos. Steel met steel. Screams tore through the mist. Horses reared and fell. And amid the relentless storm of combat, the women moved with precision born of fear, training, and an unbreakable bond. Even in the midst of violence, small moments of humanity emerged. A glance shared with a fallen comrade, a whispered encouragement, a hand reaching out to pull someone from the mud. These fleeting gestures, easily overlooked, carried more weight than any sword. They were reminders that even in war, even on the bloodiest of fields, courage and compassion could survive. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the battle had settled into a tense stalemate. Haruko surveyed the field, noting the cost: bodies, broken weapons, scorched earth, and hearts worn thin. Yet the river crossing remained theirs, a fragile victory in a world of chaos. And in that moment, Haruko understood something fundamental. Victory was never measured solely by territory or enemy casualties. It was measured by the endurance of spirit, the refusal to yield to fear, and the willingness to fight for something greater than oneself. As the women regrouped, tending to the wounded and reloading their weapons, the distant echo of drums signaled that this battle was far from over. But for now, they had survived, they had endured, and they had proven in blood and fire that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The battlefield lay drenched in morning mist, the scent of smoke and wet earth clinging to every surface. The sun had barely risen, yet the rumble of marching feet and the clash of armor echoed across the hills. Haruko crouched behind a jagged boulder, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the hilt of her katana until her knuckles whitened. Around her, the women of her unit adjusted their armor, checked their weapons, and exchanged silent, meaningful glances. The air was thick with anticipation and fear, an almost tangible weight pressing on their shoulders. "Haruko," whispered Aiko, one of the younger warriors, her voice trembling. "Do you think we can hold them?" Haruko's eyes swept over the valley below, where enemy soldiers formed ranks, their banners snapping the cold morning wind. She inhaled deeply, tasting the bitter tang of anxiety and the metallic edge of her own resolve. "We must," she replied firmly. "Not for glory, not for reward, but because if we fail, everything we've fought for will vanish." The first scouts appeared over the ridge, barely more than shadows in the mist. A volley of arrows was loosed, shrieking through the morning air. Haruko's squad raised their shields just in time. A few arrows embedded themselves in wet earth around them. Others thudded against armor. A soldier near Haruko hissed in pain as a stray arrow nicked his shoulder. She leaned over to help, pressing a hand to the wound, murmuring words meant to soothe, though she felt none herself. Suddenly, the enemy cavalry surged forward. Horses thundered over the wet soil, hooves sending mud flying. The women braced themselves, forming a tight line across the narrow pass. Haruko's heart pounded, each beat echoing the rhythm of drums from the enemy camp. She swung her sword in a precise arc, deflecting an incoming strike from a heavily armored horseman. The clang of metal against metal rang sharp and urgent, a symphony of chaos. "Hold! Hold the line!" Haruko's voice rose above the din, fierce and commanding. She moved like a shadow through the melee, her movements precise, economical, yet deadly. Every parry, every strike, was a matter of life and death. Beside her, Michiko fought with the grace of a veteran, her blade a blur as she cut down one enemy after another. The women's coordination was their greatest weapon, a silent testament to their training and their bond. Through the fog, Haruko glimpsed the enemy commander, a towering figure in crimson armor, signaling his troops with calculated precision. She felt a flicker of recognition. This was a man who had fought many battles, who knew the weight of strategy and the fragility of morale. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of each other's skill, before the tide of combat swept them apart. The ground shook as the enemy pressed forward, and the line of women wavered. Haruko shouted, directing reinforcements to the left flank, where archers had begun to falter under a concentrated charge. "Cover them! Push them back!" she barked. Her orders were obeyed without hesitation, a testament to the respect she commanded and the trust they placed in one another. Amid the clash of steel, a fire ignited in a supply wagon downstream, sending black smoke curling into the sky. The heat was palpable, a reminder that the battle was not contained to a single front. Haruko saw the wagon and realized its destruction would disrupt the enemy's advance, giving them a chance to regroup. "Push forward!" she cried, rallying a group of warriors to flank the enemy through the smoke. The maneuver was perilous. Arrows rained down as the women advanced, their shields raised, their movements synchronized like a deadly dance. Haruko felt an arrow graze her shoulder, the pain sharp but manageable. She pressed on, forcing herself to focus on the rhythm of combat rather than the sting. Each step was a careful calculation, each strike a statement of survival. A sudden scream pierced the battlefield. Haruko turned to see Aiko struck down, clutching her leg as she collapsed. Haruko sprinted to her, cutting down an enemy soldier who tried to press the advantage. She dropped to the ground beside Aiko, pressing a hand to the wound, murmuring encouragement. The young warrior's eyes met hers, wide with fear, and for a moment Haruko saw reflected the fragility of human life amidst the relentless tide of war. "Stay with me," Haruko urged, gripping Aiko's hand. Around them, the battle raged on, but for a moment, they were bound by something stronger than fear. The unyielding will survive and protect one another. The enemy cavalry, sensing a vulnerability, pushed harder. Haruko rose, dragging Aiko to her feet, and rejoined the fray. They fought through the narrow pass, leveraging the terrain to compensate for their smaller numbers. Rocks, fallen trees, and mud became weapons as well as obstacles. Haruko shouted orders, rallying the women to use every advantage. Drive them into the river. Force them where their numbers count for nothing. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. The sun climbed higher, and the mist began to burn away, revealing the true cost of the engagement. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, flags torn and trampled, and the river below ran red with the blood of the fallen. Yet the women pressed on, their spirits unbroken despite exhaustion and pain. Haruko found herself facing the enemy commander once more. This time, they clashed directly, blade against blade, each strike ringing with the fury of a storm. He was strong, calculated, but she was faster, her movements honed by countless hours of training and the urgency of protecting her sisters. With a final, decisive strike, she disarmed him, forcing him to retreat. A cheer rose from the women as the enemy began to fall back, their lines broken. But victory was bittersweet. Haruko surveyed the field, noting the cost. Aiko and several others were wounded, some gravely. The river crossing was theirs, but only barely. She knelt, helping to lift the injured and patching wounds with whatever supplies they had left. "Courage!" she whispered, glancing at the horizon where more enemy forces might be gathering. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to face it. Her voice carried across the battlefield, almost lost amidst the chaos, yet enough to remind the women of why they fought. Not for conquest, not for glory, but for each other. As the sun began its descent, casting a golden glow over the scarred landscape, Haruko allowed herself a brief moment to reflect. They had survived, they had endured, and they had proven their mettle against overwhelming odds. Yet the war was far from over. Every victory demanded sacrifice, and every day on this battlefield would test the limits of their courage. And in that reflection, she understood the deeper truth of their struggle. That history would remember not just the men who wielded swords, but the women who bore the weight of war with equal, unflinching resolve. In the mist, on the riverbanks, amid the cries and the clash of steel, they were warriors. They were samurai, and they were not forgotten. The air was heavy with smoke and the coppery scent of blood as the samurai women regrouped behind the riverbank. The early victory had bought them only minutes of respite. Haruko knelt, inspecting the damage done to their small unit. Several warriors were injured, some barely conscious, and others simply staring blankly at the horizon, minds numbed by the carnage they had witnessed. A distant horn echoed from the hills beyond the river, low and threatening. The enemy was returning, reinforced, more numerous than before. Haruko rose, her armor scraping against her back as she scanned the terrain. The river, once a potential lifeline, now threatened to become a trap if they were cut off. "Listen," she said, her voice firm yet weary, gathering the women around her. "They will strike again. This time, they'll try to overwhelm us completely. We cannot let them." Aiko, her leg bandaged as best they could, nodded shakily. "We don't have the numbers," she whispered. Haruko placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Numbers mean nothing if you know the land and have the will to fight. We have both. Use the river, use the terrain. Make them pay for every step." The women moved into position along the river's edge. Fallen logs and jagged rocks provided natural cover, while the current offered a defensive barrier. Haruko could hear the enemy organizing in the distance. The clinking of armor, the shout of orders, the unmistakable sound of cavalry readying for a charge. "On my mark," Haruko instructed. "Draw them in, then strike where it hurts." The enemy advanced cautiously at first, testing the riverbanks. Arrows hissed through the air, and a few enemy scouts fell into the muddy water, dragged down by the current. Haruko signaled her archers, hidden behind rocks, to target the exposed enemy soldiers. Each shot was precise, deadly, and calculated. The enemy faltered, unsure of the sudden resistance. But hesitation was fleeting. With a deafening roar, the cavalry surged forward, splashing into the river with boots and hooves, water flying in chaotic arcs. Haruko met them head-on, her sword ablur as she deflected strikes, parried blows, and countered with lethal precision. Beside her, Michiko fought like a tempest, each swing of her blade cutting down another horseman, another soldier. The riverbank became a maelstrom, water churned with mud and blood. Shouts of pain, the clanging of steel, and the cries of fallen comrades merged into a relentless, overwhelming cacophony. Haruko felt her muscles burn, her lungs scream, but she pressed on. Every moment counted. Every strike could mean the difference between life and death. Suddenly, a roar came from upstream. Reinforcements, another wave of enemy soldiers, this time on horseback, were flanking from the northern ridge. Haruko's heart sank. Their numbers were becoming impossible to counter. She called out to the women around her, "Hold them here as long as you can. Draw them into the rocks." Aiko, despite her injured leg, ran to position herself behind a jagged boulder, shield raised. Haruko followed, cutting down a soldier who tried to flank from the river. The women fought with desperation, each aware that failure could mean annihilation. In the midst of the chaos, Haruko saw something that stole her breath. A young enemy soldier, barely older than a boy, struggling in the river's current, unable to keep himself afloat. She hesitated, sword raised, knowing that sparing him could be fatal. Yet her heart could not allow him to drown. With a swift movement, she lunged, grabbing his arm and pulling him to safety on the riverbank. "Why? Why save me?" the boy gasped, shivering in the cold water. "Because courage does not mean cruelty," Haruko said, voice low but firm. "And mercy is a strength you will need one day." The moment was fleeting. The enemy pressed, and Haruko returned to the fray. Blood and water mingled as she parried another strike, dodged a thrust, and sent an attacker tumbling into the river. The battle had become a test of endurance, a trial not only of skill but of spirit. Hours passed, or it might have been minutes. Time lost all meaning amid the relentless tide of violence. Haruko's vision narrowed to the space immediately around her. The enemy's soldiers she could strike, the women she could protect, the river that could serve as both shield and trap. Exhaustion threatened to overtake her, but she forced herself to focus. At the height of the battle, a sudden explosion rocked the northern ridge. A cache of enemy supplies had ignited, possibly struck by one of their hidden archers or perhaps by accident. Flames shot skyward, smoke curling in thick black spirals. The distraction caused confusion among the enemy ranks. Haruko seized the opportunity. "Push forward. Strike now!" she yelled, rallying the women for a counterattack. With renewed ferocity, they surged, meeting the disoriented soldiers with precision honed by training and necessity. One by one, the enemy began to retreat, some falling into the river, others fleeing toward the hills, leaving behind the banners and symbols of their command. When the dust settled, the riverbank was eerily quiet. Bodies lay scattered, some friend, some foe, a grim testament to the cost of survival. Haruko stood among them, chest heaving, sweat and blood soaking her armor. She looked at the women around her, exhausted, battered, yet alive. They had survived what seemed impossible. Aiko limped toward her, supported by Michiko. "We did it," she said softly, voice trembling. We really did it." Haruko nodded, eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of further attack. "For now," she said, voice heavy with the weight of the day. "But the war is far from over. We have bought time, but the price has been high." She knelt, tending to the wounded as best she could, reflecting on the events that had transpired, the courage she had witnessed. The willingness to fight in the face of impossible odds was awe-inspiring, yet the cost was unmistakable. Fear, pain, loss, and the unrelenting burden of responsibility. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the river, Haruko allowed herself a moment of solemn reflection. They had fought not only for survival, but for each other, for honor, and for the hope that their actions would be remembered. History would judge the men of the battlefield, yet the deeds of these women, the samurai who had carried themselves with courage and resolve, would live on in their stories, in whispers among those who knew the truth. The enemy had retreated for now, but Haruko knew it was only a matter of time before they returned, stronger, more determined. The river crossing was theirs, but the battle was far from over. Still, she stood resolute, shoulder to shoulder with her sisters in arms, knowing that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, and that every scar, every wound, every sacrifice carried meaning far beyond the fleeting victory of the day. In the fading light, Haruko looked out across the valley, feeling the weight of what they had endured and the responsibility that still lay ahead. The river flowed steadily, indifferent to the blood shed upon its banks, a quiet reminder that time marches on, whether or not the living are ready to follow. And in that flowing water, she found a strange comfort, that even in war life persisted, and with it, the unyielding spirit of those who refused to surrender. The dawn was muted, a pale gray haze hanging over the river valley. Haruko's body ached from the previous day's relentless combat, yet she moved with practiced determination, surveying the riverbank as the first light struck the water. The enemy had retreated, but intelligence from scouts indicated they were regrouping not far beyond the northern ridge. Their next assault would not be merely a test of strength, but a calculated attempt to annihilate the women who had dared defy them. "Haruko," Michiko whispered, handing her a damp cloth to wipe her face. "We need a plan. If they return in force, we cannot hold a line, as we did yesterday." Haruko nodded, her mind already racing through possibilities. "We cannot rely on brute force alone. We must anticipate their movements, force them into traps, use the terrain to our advantage. The river is our ally, but we must turn it into a weapon." The women gathered, tired yet attentive, as Haruko drew a rough diagram in the mud with a stick. "The enemy will attempt a pincer maneuver," she explained, pointing toward the ridges. "If we allow them to flank us, the river becomes a death trap. But if we control the crossing, force them to funnel through narrow points, we can reduce their numbers advantage. Archers here, stones and spikes along the banks, and I will lead a strike team to harass their command." Aiko winced at the words, favoring her injured leg, but Haruko caught her eye. "I know it's difficult," she said gently, "but your role is crucial. Each of you is crucial. Without you, this plan fails." Hours passed as the women prepared. They reinforced the riverbanks with sharpened stakes hidden beneath the water's surface, camouflaged with mud and reeds. Rocks were piled strategically, ready to be toppled onto the enemy as they attempted to cross. Archers positioned themselves along high points, waiting for the signal. Every movement was precise, a careful choreography dictated by urgency and fear alike. By midday, the first signs of the enemy appeared on the northern ridge. Haruko's pulse quickened. The soldiers moved with a grim determination, a living wave of steel and muscle. Their commander, the same man from the previous battle, rode at the front, surveying the terrain with sharp eyes. He had learned from their previous encounter, and Haruko knew he would anticipate a straightforward defense. They had to be unpredictable. "Steady," she murmured to the women around her. "Wait for my signal. Do not engage until we force them into the trap." The enemy advanced, and Haruko could feel the tension coiling in the air like a living thing. The river, deceptively calm, reflected the gray sky above, hiding the deadly stakes submerged beneath its surface. Haruko's heart pounded in time with the distant thud of hooves and the sharp clatter of armor. Then came the first mistake of the enemy: overconfidence. A group of cavalry, eager to claim the crossing, charged too quickly, their formation uneven. Haruko seized the opportunity. "Now!" she shouted. Archers unleashed a volley of arrows, cutting through the forward soldiers. Stones and sharpened spikes toppled onto the narrow crossing points, sending men and horses screaming into the river. The current claimed several, dragging them downstream, their armor weighing them into watery graves. Chaos erupted in the enemy ranks. But victory was far from assured. The enemy commander, recognizing the trap, signaled a retreat of the vanguard while redirecting reinforcements to flank the women. Haruko felt a surge of urgency. The pincer was forming faster than anticipated. "Form the secondary line," she commanded, rushing to support the archers under heavy fire. The women moved with disciplined precision, creating a layered defense that funneled the enemy into predictable channels. Haruko herself led a small squad along the river's edge, using the undergrowth and rocks for cover, striking suddenly to disrupt their momentum. Each encounter was brief, brutal, and precise, a dance with death that left both attacker and defender gasping, bleeding, yet unbowed. Amid the battle, Haruko's eyes fell on Aiko, struggling to aim her bow with her injured leg. Without hesitation, Haruko ran to her side, deflecting an enemy soldier who lunged from the flank. "Focus," she urged. "Your arrow can turn the tide. Remember that." Aiko drew her bow with trembling hands, letting an arrow fly that struck an officer leading a group of cavalry, sending them into disarray. The river valley had become a scene of relentless fury. Mud churned by hooves, steel flashing in sunlight, screams and cries blending with the roar of the water. The enemy was relentless, but the women were unyielding. Haruko moved from point to point, rallying, fighting, encouraging. Exhaustion threatened to collapse her, but adrenaline and necessity kept her moving. Hours passed, each moment stretching like an eternity. Slowly, imperceptibly, the enemy began to break. Units that had pressed forward with aggression now faltered, disorganized by the layered defenses and sudden ambushes. Haruko could see the commander struggling to maintain cohesion, his face drawn tight with frustration. Sensing the moment, Haruko rallied the remaining women. "Push forward. Strike now with everything we have." They surged, meeting the exhausted soldiers at the river's edge, blades clashing, shields raised, every movement fueled by resolve and survival instinct. The enemy commander fell back once more, signaling a full retreat down the northern ridge. Silence followed the chaos, broken only by the distant flow of the river and the labored breathing of the survivors. Haruko stood, surveying the aftermath. The river, once a simple crossing, had become both shield and weapon. The enemy had been repelled, their numbers diminished, morale broken, for now. But the cost was visible in the bloodied ground and the exhausted faces of her companions. Haruko walked among them, kneeling to support the wounded, offering water and words of comfort. "We survived," she murmured, "but never forget the price. Courage is not enough without sacrifice." Aiko, leaning against Michiko, whispered, We really did it this time." Haruko nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the enemy retreated. "We did, but the war is not over. Remember that. Every battle carries its own cost, and every victory is only temporary. We fight not because we wish to, but because it must be done." As the sun dipped toward the western hills, Haruko allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The river continued its steady flow, indifferent to the human struggle on its banks. And yet, in its endless movement, It mirrored the perseverance of the women who had fought here, not just for survival, but for honor, for legacy, and for each other. In that stillness, she understood the truth of their struggle. The battlefield measured strength, skill, and courage, yes, but also measured the will to endure, to rise again after every fall. And in that endurance, history would remember not just the men who wielded swords, but the women who fought with unmatched bravery, leaving behind a legacy that would echo far beyond the river valley, far beyond the battle itself. The battlefield was quiet, but the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Smoke lingered over the river, twisting upward in lazy spirals, carrying the remnants of fire and iron with it. Haruko moved among her unit, her eyes scanning the faces of her sisters in arms. Exhaustion etched deep lines into their features, yet there was still fire in their eyes, a mixture of pride, fear, and the grim determination that had carried them this far. Aiko sat on a fallen log, her legs still bandaged, bow resting across her lap. "We've held the river," she whispered, almost to herself. "We've actually held it." Haruko crouched beside her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Yes," she said softly, "but the enemy is not done. They will return, stronger and smarter. Today we survived. Tomorrow we must be ready again." The morning passed with grim work, tending to wounds, repairing armor, checking weapons, and fortifying the riverbank further. Every task was performed with a tense awareness, as though the slightest lapse might invite disaster. Haruko watched the women around her and felt a swell of pride mixed with sorrow. Each of them had faced death and emerged alive, but the toll was evident in every movement, every glance. By mid-afternoon, scouts returned with troubling news. "They've summoned reinforcements from the eastern plains," one reported, voice tight with apprehension. "They'll strike at dusk. We may not have another chance to prepare." Haruko's jaw tightened. Reinforcements meant more soldiers, more cavalry, and perhaps even artillery, although rumors suggested the enemy had brought primitive siege engines. The river, while a natural defense, could only protect them so far. Strategy, cunning, and relentless courage would be the only shields left. "Gather the unit," Haruko ordered. "We need a plan that will hold, not just today, but through the night if necessary. We will use traps, decoys, and every advantage the terrain offers. This is no longer just defense. It is survival." The women listened intently as she outlined her strategy. Some would remain at the riverbank, continuing to use stakes, rocks, and the current to hinder enemy advances. Others would act as mobile strike teams, flanking, harassing, and cutting communication lines. Haruko herself would lead the most dangerous task, infiltrating the enemy's forward position to disrupt command and morale. As preparations continued, the first signs of the enemy appeared in the distance. Banners flapping, dust rising in small clouds, the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Haruko felt a familiar coil of tension in her stomach, the mingling of fear and resolve. She could hear the whispers of her own heartbeat above the din in her mind. "Remember," she said quietly, gathering her strike team, "we are not just fighting soldiers. We are the living testament that courage is not bound by gender or expectation. Today we fight not only for victory, but for honor and for each other. Fail, and none of us will return." The enemy approached cautiously, wary after their previous failures. They were disciplined, organized, and led by commanders who had learned from prior encounters. The first volleys of arrows and javelins rained down, thudding into shields and armor. Haruko and her team darted between cover, striking suddenly from the tree-line, and then retreating before the enemy could respond. The clash was brutal, precise, and exhausting. At one point, Haruko found herself face to face with a young officer attempting to rally a group of cavalry. Their eyes met, a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden of command, and then the duel began. Steel rang against steel, sparks flying in the dimming light. Each strike was a conversation, each parry a negotiation of life and death. Finally, Haruko disarmed him with a deft movement, forcing him to retreat with the rest of his men. But even small victories came at a cost. Among the fallen was Hana, one of the bravest of the younger warriors. Haruko found her collapsed beneath a toppled log, bloodied and still. She knelt, gripping her friend's hand, trying to stem the flow, but it was too late. Hana's eyes, wide with disbelief and fear, met Haruko's, and for a brief, heartbreaking moment, there was a silent understanding, a shared acknowledgement of sacrifice, courage, and the inevitability of loss. "No," Haruko whispered, voice tight with grief. She allowed herself a moment to mourn, but there was no time to linger. The enemy pressed forward, sensing the vulnerability that grief can create. With a deep breath, she rose, forcing herself to focus. Hana would not want us to falter. We continue. The battle evolved into a brutal dance of ambushes, counterattacks, and carefully timed retreats. Haruko led her teams along narrow paths and hidden gullies, striking the enemy from unexpected angles. Rocks tumbled down cliffs, arrows rained from above, and the river's current claimed those who fell into it unprepared. Every maneuver required precision and nerve. Every strike was a result of careful planning, honed skill, and unyielding determination. By dusk, the enemy was in disarray. Their formations were broken, morale shattered by constant harassment, and the relentless resilience of the women. Yet Haruko knew this victory was temporary. The larger force waiting beyond the hills would return, and with them, greater danger. Still, as she stood among her sisters, surveying the battlefield littered with both enemy and ally, there was a grim satisfaction. They had held the line, they had endured, and they had fought with honor. As night fell, the women tended the wounded by torchlight, the river reflecting flickers of fire and shadow. Haruko knelt beside Aiko, inspecting the bandages, and whispered, "We live to fight another day. That is what matters." Aiko looked up, exhausted, but her eyes shone with determination. "We'll survive," she said softly. "We must." Haruko allowed herself a long, weary sigh, realizing the weight of the responsibility she carried. Every decision, every order had consequences. Every life mattered, and every loss left a scar not only on the body, but on the spirit. In the quiet that followed the evening's engagement, Haruko reflected on the cost of their struggle. Courage was not an abstract notion. It was tangible, measured in blood, sweat, and the willingness to face death unflinchingly. Sacrifice was not theoretical. It was a presence felt in the ache of limbs, the cries of the fallen, and the silent grief of those who survived. Yet despite the sorrow and exhaustion, there was an undeniable truth. The women had proven themselves. Against overwhelming odds, they had held the river, defended each other, and demonstrated that strength, skill, and resolve were not bound by tradition or expectation. Their story, written in mud, blood, and sweat, would endure as a testament of bravery, sacrifice, and unyielding determination. Haruko looked out over the river, the waters glinting in the faint moonlight, and whispered a silent promise. "We will endure. We will fight. And no matter the cost, we will be remembered." The night was restless. Crickets chirped through the mist, but their song was drowned out by the low moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of the enemy preparing for another assault. Haruko moved along the riverbank, her sword slung across her back, inspecting the fences and speaking quietly to each of her sisters in arms. Every woman bore exhaustion like armor, but their eyes remained sharp, watchful, unyielding. "Haruko," Michiko whispered, drawing close, "they're gathering beyond the ridge. The scouts say they reinforce their cavalry and infantry. If they strike at dawn, we may not hold them." Haruko's jaw tightened. "Then we prepare for everything," she said, her voice steady though her heart raced. "Tonight, we fortify, and tomorrow, we make them pay for every step into this valley. We cannot falter, not now, not ever." Under the pale moonlight, the women worked tirelessly. Stakes were sharpened and hidden beneath the riverbanks. Traps were dug, and decoys arranged to confuse the enemy. Stones were piled in precarious positions, ready to crush charging soldiers. Archers practiced quick volleys, and small teams rehearsed flanking maneuvers. Even the wounded contributed where they could, offering encouragement, maintaining morale, and holding the line in spirit if not in body. Haruko paused for a moment, surveying the battlefield. She traced a faint outline of the river and imagined the chaos to come. She thought of Hana, of others who had fallen, and of the countless sacrifices yet to come. Her chest tightened at the weight of responsibility. Every life in her unit was a life she could not waste. The first light of dawn broke through the mist, silver and pale, revealing the enemy massing on the northern ridge. The banners of the reinforced force snapped sharply in the wind, a visible manifestation of both power and threat. Haruko felt a familiar coil of fear tighten in her stomach, but she turned it into focus. This would be the decisive battle, the moment when courage and strategy would determine survival. "Positions!" she called, her voice carrying across the valley. Women scrambled into place, gripping weapons, checking armor, hearts pounding in unison. The river, now a mirror of sunlight and shadow, was both shield and trap. The enemy had learned little from the previous battles. Their confidence made them predictable. Haruko intended to exploit it. The first attack came with a roar. Cavalry thundered down the ridge, hooves sending mud and water flying, swords glinting in the rising sun. Archers on the riverbank loosed arrows, picking off stragglers, while hidden rocks toppled onto the narrow crossing points, unbalancing the horses. The enemy faltered, but only briefly, their disciplined formation absorbing the shock and pressing forward. Haruko led her strike team along the tree line, moving like shadows, cutting down officers and disrupting communications. Each movement was precise, a blend of strategy and instinct honed over months of relentless combat. Beside her, Michiko and Aiko fought with lethal grace, each strike calculated, each defense unyielding. The river roared alongside them, carrying the bodies of those who had fallen into its depths, an indifferent witness to the carnage. Then came the turning point. The enemy commander, recognizing the traps, signaled a concentrated push toward the center, attempting to break the riverbank line. Haruko felt a pang of dread. If they succeeded, the flank could collapse, and with it, the defense of the entire valley. "Hold them here," she shouted. "Do not let them break the line." The clash was brutal. Steel rang against steel. Screams tore through the valley, and the ground shook under the thunder hooves. Haruko's arms burned, her lungs ached, but she pressed on. Every move was survival. Every strike was necessity. She watched as Aiko, bow trembling in her hands, fired arrows that found their marks with deadly precision. Each one turned the tide in small, critical increments. Amid the chaos, a soldier slipped past the defenses, aiming for the archers. Haruko intercepted him, their swords clashing with a ringing force that echoed across the valley. The struggle was desperate, the outcome uncertain. But with a final, practiced motion, she disarmed him and sent him sprawling into the mud. She barely had time to breathe before a fresh wave of attackers surged forward. The river itself became a weapon. Enemy soldiers attempting to ford it were caught by submerged stakes, swept away by the current, or struck by boulders toppled from the cliffs above. Yet even as they suffered losses, the enemy pressed with relentless determination. Haruko realized that victory would require more than courage. It would demand sacrifice, cunning, and every ounce of endurance they could muster. Suddenly, from the eastern slope, a fresh wave of infantry appeared, moving to encircle the women. Haruko's heart sank. The flank she had feared was under threat. She gathered her remaining strike team. "We cannot let them surround us. Cut them off, disrupt their lines, and return here," she commanded, voice sharp with urgency. The women moved like specters through the mist, striking suddenly, retreating, and striking again. Every engagement was perilous, each moment a battle of life and death. Haruko felt exhaustion gnawing at her resolve, but the determination of her sisters in arms carried her forward. Together, they disrupted the enemy's formations, buying precious time for the riverbank defenses to hold. Hours stretched on in a relentless cycle of attack and counterattack. Haruko's mind blurred with fatigue, yet clarity emerged in moments of instinctive action. Every trap triggered, every arrow loosed, every boulder toppled was a small victory against overwhelming odds. The enemy commander, furious and frustrated, rallied what remained of his forces, attempting a final, desperate push toward the river crossing. Haruko anticipated his movement. She signaled the hidden archers, who unleashed a final devastating volley. Stones and sharpened stakes claimed their victims, and the river swallowed those who stumbled in desperation. The enemy lines wavered, broke, and finally faltered. With a collective cry, the women pressed forward, driving the remnants back into retreat. The valley fell silent, save for the rush of the river and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Haruko looked around at her companions, bruised, bloodied, exhausted, yet alive. The victory had been costly, but it was theirs. They had survived not only the enemy's assault, but the unrelenting test of courage, skill, and endurance. Haruko knelt beside the wounded, tending to the injured, offering comfort where she could. "We fought," she whispered, voice heavy with exhaustion. "We endured, and though many have fallen, their courage lives on in us. We are the river, unbroken, flowing onward." Aiko, leaning heavily on Michiko, managed a weak smile. "We'd survived. Somehow." Haruko nodded, her eyes tracing the distant horizon. "Yes," she said softly, "but the war continues. Every battle has its cost, and every victory is temporary. We remember the fallen, honor their sacrifice, and prepare for what comes next." As the sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the river, Haruko allowed herself a moment of reflection. The battlefield was a place of blood and fire, of courage and loss. Yet in the faces of the women around her, she saw hope, resilience, and an unbroken spirit. History would remember the men of war, but it was their story. The women who fought with honor, cunning, and unmatched bravery that would endure in whispers, in memory, and in legacy. And in the quiet aftermath, Haruko understood that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. True strength was measured not by the number of victories, but by the will to rise after every fall, and the determination to protect those who depended upon you, even at the cost of your own life. The valley was quiet at first light, but Haruko felt the tension in the air like a living thing. Every tree, every shadow, seemed to hold the promise of death. The enemy had been pushed back, but scouts reported movement beyond the ridges, small, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. This battle, she knew, would not be won by brute strength alone. Cunning endurance and courage would be tested to their limits. The women moved with purpose, repairing defenses along the riverbank, adjusting stakes, and preparing traps. Even the wounded participated where they could, using their presence to bolster morale and offering guidance from the sidelines. Haruko felt a deep, aching pride in their resilience, tempered by the grief of losses sustained. Hana's absence was a constant shadow, and every movement reminded her of the sacrifices made. "Haruko," Michiko said quietly, drawing close. "We've heard rumors. They've called for reinforcements from the eastern plains, more than before. This could be their final assault." Haruko's jaw tightened. "Then we make this final stand count. We fight not only for survival, but for the memory of those who cannot fight alongside us. We honor their courage with our own." The enemy advanced at midday. Dust rose from the hills like smoke from a funeral pyre, and the thunder hooves echoed ominously across the valley. Haruko positioned her unit carefully, ensuring the river, the terrain, and every obstacle would be used to their advantage. Archers took positions high above, ready to unleash deadly volleys, while strike teams, including Haruko herself, prepared to harass and disrupt the enemy's lines. The first wave struck with calculated aggression. Cavalry surged into the river, splashing water into the muddy banks, while infantry pressed forward in tight formations. The women held their ground, parrying, striking, and retreating in coordinated movements that maximized the defensive advantage of the terrain. Every moment was life or death, every decision precise and deliberate. Amid the chaos, Haruko caught sight of Aiko struggling to fire arrows with her injured leg. Without hesitation, she ran to her side, deflecting a soldier who lunged from the flank. "Focus," she urged. "Your shot can turn the tide." Aiko let an arrow fly that struck an enemy officer attempting to rally the troops, sowing confusion. The battle became a blur of steel, mud, and blood. Haruko moved from point to point, rallying women, cutting down attackers, and protecting the archers. Each swing of her blade, each command, was a testament to months of training, experience, and sheer will. Yet the cost was evident. Wounded lay along the riverbanks, some moaning, some silent. Every moment of victory was shadowed by loss. Then the enemy commander, the same figure who had haunted their previous battles, emerged from the northern ridge with a fresh contingent. His eyes swept over the battlefield, calculating, ruthless, determined. Haruko recognized the danger immediately. He was attempting to outflank them, a maneuver that could collapse their defenses in minutes. "Form the secondary line," she commanded. cut them off before they encircle us. The women moved quickly, creating a layered defense. Haruko led a strike team along the tree line, ambushing the enemy as they attempted to flank. Rocks tumbled from the cliffs, arrows rained from above, and the river claimed those who fell unprepared. Every engagement was a brutal test of endurance, skill, and nerve. Hours passed, the sun climbing high before beginning its slow descent. Exhaustion gnawed at the women's bodies, yet their resolve never wavered. Haruko's muscles burned, her lungs ached, but she pressed on, driven by the weight of responsibility and the memory of those they had lost. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. Haruko spun to see Yumi, one of the younger warriors, pinned beneath a fallen tree, an enemy soldier looming over her. Without hesitation, Haruko lunged, driving the attacker back and lifting the log with all her strength. Yumi collapsed into her arms, gasping but alive. "Thank you," she whispered, fear and gratitude mingling in her eyes. The enemy commander, sensing his plan unraveling, signaled a concentrated assault at the center. Haruko met them head-on, clashing with officers and cavalry alike. The ground shook under the onslaught, the river churned with debris and blood, and the air was thick with smoke, mud, and the cries of combatants. Amid the frenzy, Haruko realized a painful truth. Victory would demand further sacrifice. Even now, they had barely held, and another wave would push them to the brink. Yet retreat was impossible. The river, the valley, and their honor demanded they stand. The turning point came unexpectedly. A hidden charge of enemy infantry attempted to cross as shallow point, only to be caught in a deadly trap Haruko had prepared. Stakes, rocks, and sudden volleys of arrows tore through their ranks, and the enemy commander's expression faltered as he witnessed the destruction. Seizing the moment, Haruko led a final, decisive push, rallying her exhausted sisters in arms to drive the enemy from the riverbank completely. By dusk, the battlefield was eerily silent. The enemy had retreated in disarray, their lines broken, morale shattered. The river flowed steadily, indifferent to the blood and sacrifice upon its banks. Haruko moved among the women, tending to the wounded, offering water, comfort, and words of encouragement. Aiko limped toward her, leaning heavily on Michiko. "We survived," she whispered, voice trembling with relief. Haruko nodded, eyes on the horizon where the enemy had vanished. "Yes," she said softly, "but the cost has been great. Courage, skill, and endurance carried us today. But we honor those who cannot continue by remembering their sacrifice and fighting with renewed resolve tomorrow." In the quiet that followed, Haruko reflected on the events of the day. True courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. True strength was not measured by victories alone, but by the will to endure, to protect, and arise again after every fall. Each wound, each loss, each moment of exhaustion carried meaning far beyond the battlefield. As night fell over the valley, Haruko looked out across the river, the water shimmering under the moonlight. She thought of Hana, of Yumi, of Aiko, and of every woman who had fought and fallen. They had endured the unthinkable, and yet they remained unbroken. Their story, etched in courage, sacrifice, and unyielding determination, would live on, not merely in history, but in the memory of all who witnessed their valor. And in that solemn, quiet moment, Haruko understood the essence of their struggle. That war exacted a cost, but courage, honor, and sacrifice were immortal. The river flowed onward, a witness to the deeds of those who fought with every ounce of their being, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the spirit of resilience could prevail. The valley lay cloaked in a heavy dawn mist, the river whispering against its banks as though aware of the storm approaching. Haruko stood atop a small rise, surveying the battlefield. Her armor was battered, streaked with blood and mud, and every muscle in her body ached from days of relentless combat. Yet she stood firm, eyes narrowing at the distant movement along the northern ridge. The enemy had returned, more numerous than ever, their banners snapping like thunder in the wind. "Haruko," Michiko said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "This is more than they've ever brought. Can we hold them?" Haruko's eyes scanned her women, bruised, bleeding, tired, but unwavering. "We hold," she said firmly. "We do not retreat. Every step we take, every breath we draw, is for our sisters, for the fallen, and for honor itself." Today we fight and we endure. Remember that. The women moved into position with a quiet determination that belied the storm about to break. Stakes had been sharpened, traps hidden beneath the mud, and archers took high positions, their arrows ready to rain death upon those who dared approach. Haruko led the strike teams through the undergrowth, ready to harass the enemy and disrupt their formations. Every moment was a calculated risk. Every decision weighed heavily with the lives of her sisters in arms. The first wave of the enemy struck with overwhelming force. Cavalry thundered across the riverbanks. Infantry pressed forward in tight formations, and the clash of steel echoed through the valley like rolling thunder. Haruko met them at the forefront, her sword ablur as she cut down those who pressed too close. Around her, the women moved with lethal precision, each aware of the cost of hesitation. Arrows hissed through the air, finding their marks with deadly accuracy. Rocks toppled onto charging soldiers, sending them screaming into the river's icy embrace. Traps hidden beneath the mud claimed their victims, and the river itself became a weapon, swallowing men who stumbled unprepared. Yet even as the enemy faltered, they pressed relentlessly, determined to break the line. Amid the chaos, Haruko saw Aiko struggling to draw her bow with her injured leg. Without hesitation, she dashed to her side, parrying a sword swing aimed at the young warrior. "Focus," she yelled. "Your arrow can change this." Aiko's arrow flew, striking an officer attempting to rally a cavalry charge, and the enemy line wavered. The battle escalated into a storm of steel, mud, and blood. Haruko moved from point to point, rallying women, cutting down attackers, and protecting the archers. Every strike carried the weight of life or death, and every movement required precision honed by months of relentless practice. Exhaustion gnawed at her, but she pressed on, fueled by the knowledge that faltering even for a moment could cost lives. Then, in the midst of the fray, a scream tore through the battlefield. Haruko spun to see Yumi, one of the younger warriors, pinned beneath a fallen log, an enemy soldier looming over her. With a cry, she lunged, driving the attacker back and lifting the log with all her strength. Yumi collapsed into her arms, gasping but alive. "Thank you," she whispered, fear and gratitude mingling in her eyes. The enemy commander, recognizing the dire situation, signaled a concentrated assault toward the river crossing. Haruko anticipated the maneuver, signaling hidden archers and strike teams to intercept. Arrows flew, rocks tumbled, and spikes claimed those who pressed forward. The enemy line faltered, breaking in scattered retreats, yet the commander himself remained defiant, rallying a small contingent for a desperate final push. Haruko met him directly, blade clashing against blade in a duel that seemed to stretch time itself. The sound of steel against steel rang through the valley, a harsh, urgent music of survival. Each strike was precise, each parry deliberate. Around them, the battle surged, men and women locked in the brutal rhythm of war. Finally, with a deft, calculated movement, Haruko disarmed the commander, forcing him to his knees. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "This cannot be," he growled, voice strained. "How?" "Courage," Haruko replied, blade resting lightly at his throat. "Sacrifice, honor, and the will to endure what others cannot." The enemy, seeing their leader defeated, faltered completely. Scattered soldiers fled into the river and hills, leaving behind the banners and symbols of command. The valley, once a maelstrom of violence, fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the rush of the river and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Haruko moved among her women, tending to the wounded, offering water and comfort. The toll of the battle was immense. Friends and sisters lost, bodies strewn across the battlefield, and exhaustion pressing down like a weight that would not lift. Yet amidst the blood and mud, there was an undeniable sense of triumph, not merely over the enemy, but over the fear, doubt, and exhaustion that had threatened to overwhelm them. Aiko limped toward Haruko, leaning on Michiko. "We did it," she whispered, voice trembling with relief and awe. Haruko nodded, eyes tracing the river as it flowed steadily, indifferent to the blood and struggle it had witnessed. "Yes," she said softly, "we did. But remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It is mastery of it. Strength is not measured in victory alone, but in the will to rise again after every fall. And honor Honor is preserved through sacrifice, loyalty, and the unwavering spirit to protect those who stand beside you. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, casting long shadows over the river, Haruko allowed herself a moment to reflect. History would remember the generals, the armies, and the victories, but it was the courage of these women, the samurai who had fought with skill, intelligence, and indomitable spirit, that would endure. Their story, written in sweat, blood, and sacrifice, would echo through generations, a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be forgotten. Haruko knelt beside the fallen, offering silent prayers for their souls, honoring their bravery, and acknowledging the weight of their sacrifice. She looked at the horizon, the river shimmering in the fading light, and whispered a vow to the memories of the fallen. We carry your courage, we carry your sacrifice, and we will endure no matter the cost. In that quiet moment, she understood the truth of their journey. That war exacted a toll beyond measure, yet courage, honor, and perseverance were immortal. The river would continue to flow, the valley would heal, and the deeds of these women, forgotten by many, remembered by some, would live on as a legacy of resilience, bravery, and unyielding determination. And in that stillness, Haruko felt the weight of history settle upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle, a reminder that the true measure of a warrior was not in the battles fought, but in the spirit with which they endured, protected, and remembered those who could not. The battlefield was silent, yet the silence was heavy, almost sacred. The river flowed steadily, carrying away debris, blood, and the remnants of battle, indifferent to the human struggle that had raged along its banks. Haruko walked among her sisters in arms, each step measured, every eye cast downward in reverence for those who had fallen. The sun hung low, painting the valley in muted golds and deep shadows, and for a brief moment, the horror of war was replaced by a quiet reflection. Is it really over? Aiko's voice was soft, almost fragile, her legs still bandaged and her body trembling with exhaustion. Haruko crouched beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. For now, she said, but the cost? The cost is something we carry forever. Every life lost, every wound, every scream, those do not fade. They remind us of what courage demands. Around them, the women moved carefully, tending to the wounded, gathering the dead with respect, and ensuring that every fallen sister was honored. Haruko observed the riverbank, scarred and marred by the battle, and thought of the countless souls who would never return to their homes. She thought of Hana, Yumi, and others whose absence left a hollow ache in her heart. And yet, despite the sorrow, there was a spark, a fragile, stubborn flame of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Haruko, Michiko said, her voice tight with emotion. We held them off. We survived. Against impossible odds, we survived. Haruko nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. We survived, she echoed, but there was no triumph in her tone. Survival had come at a cost so immense that victory fell hollow. The river whispered past her feet, carrying away the remnants of violence. Yet she knew the memories, the scars, and the lessons would remain forever. She walked slowly along the riverbank, touching the water, feeling the cool flow run through her fingers. This same river had borne witness to courage, sacrifice, and loss. It had claimed the bodies of enemies and allies alike, indifferent yet eternal. Haruko thought of history, of stories written and forgotten, and of the countless women whose deeds were erased by time, even though they had fought with the same valor as any legendary warrior. We are remembered, she whispered, almost to herself, even if history forgets our names. Our courage, our sacrifices, they live in the river, in the land, in the hearts of those who stand with us. Aiko joined her at the water's edge, leaning heavily on her crutch, but managing a faint, determined smile. Do you think people will ever know? She asked. Haruko looked at her, eyes softening with a mixture of sorrow and pride. Perhaps not in books or songs, she said. But those who survive, those who fight beside us, they carry our story. And stories endure, even when the world tries to forget. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley. Haruko called the women together one last time, forming a circle on the riverbank. Their bodies were battered, their spirits weary, but their eyes shone with unspoken understanding. They had endured what few could, had survived impossible odds, and had proven that courage was not bound by gender, status, or expectation. Haruko raised her sword, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. "We fought not for glory," she said, voice carrying over the river. "Not for wealth, nor for fame. We fought for each other, for honor, and for the memory of those who cannot stand beside us. Remember this. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the will to face it. Sacrifice is not a burden. It is the measure of what we hold most sacred. And legacy is not written in stone or ink. It is etched in the hearts of those who survive." The women lowered their weapons, some crying silently, others simply breathing in the heavy, sacred air of survival. They had endured the storm, faced death with unwavering resolve, and emerged alive. Yet the weight of what they had experienced pressed upon them, a constant reminder that war demands not only skill, but unyielding courage and sacrifice. Haruko knelt by the river once more, letting the water flow over her hands. She thought of the battles yet to come, the wars that would rage beyond this valley, and the countless women who would continue to fight unseen, unsung, and unremembered. And she made a vow that she would carry their courage, their memory, and their spirit, ensuring that the truth of their strength would endure even in the quietest whispers of history. As night fell, the valley settled into a fragile peace. The river glimmered under the moonlight, a silver thread weaving to the scars of battle. Haruko stood, shoulders straight, eyes lifted to the stars, and allowed herself a brief, rare moment of calm. The war had tested them, wounded them, and taken much from them, but it had also revealed the indomitable strength of those who refused to surrender. "We endure," she said quietly, speaking to herself, to the river, to the fallen, and to the women who stood with her. "We endure, and our courage will never be forgotten." The women, silent and exhausted, gathered together one last time. In their hearts, they carried the memories of battle, the names of the fallen, and the knowledge that they had faced death and fear with unwavering resolve. And in that shared understanding, they found not only solace, but the enduring truth of their existence, that courage, sacrifice, and loyalty were eternal, and that even in a world that often forgot, the legacy of those who fought bravely could never truly die. As the moon rose high, casting a gentle light over the river valley, Haruko took one final breath, feeling the weight of history and the enduring spirit of her sisters in arms. They had survived, they had fought, and they had left their mark, not in stone, not in chronicles, but in something far more lasting, the unyielding testament of courage, the enduring power of sacrifice, an immortal spirit of those who refused to be forgotten. The river flowed on, carrying the echoes of their struggle, a quiet witness to the bravery and resolve of the samurai women who had stood unbroken in the face of overwhelming odds. And in that eternal flow, their story lived, a testament to the truth that courage is timeless, sacrifice is sacred, and honor endures beyond the battlefield.